All right, welcome to the Cwic Media Come Follow Me series. We're covering Exodus chapters 35 through 40 and then Leviticus up through 19, primarily Leviticus 1, Leviticus 16, and Leviticus 19. Now, something to consider as we go through this. I think as I've gone through and looked through the Old Testament, this is probably, outside of really getting into the creation of the Temple of Solomon, probably the most temple imagery we're going to find in Scripture. And so keep that in mind as we go through this. The second thing I want you to keep in mind is that as these things are being built, right, as you have the tabernacle here being built and the instructions for this build, the tabernacle being built, consider something here. You are the temple, right? You are the temple. Your body is the temple. That's, to me, in my mind, just my opinion on this. I think we need to say our body up here is the temple. The temple itself that we go to is down here. And that might sound blasphemous to some people, but that temple you go to most regularly is not necessarily always going to be around, right? That's not eternal. Your body is eternal. It is a temple. And so as you look at how this temple is built, all the specifications, the exactness of measurement and angle and material, think of this as your body. Because as the temple is built in a way to house the Spirit of the Lord, your body is meant to house your spirit and the Spirit of the Lord. And so that's why I think we see so much specificity with the tabernacle and later with the Temple of Solomon. And going back to Noah's Ark, it's the same thing, right? That Noah's Ark is a temple. It is a refuge in the flood of mortality. And we see the specificity of how that is supposed to be built. And of course you have animals going in 2 by 2 in there, right? And then Nephi's ship. We don't get the specificity in there, but we understand that this is the instruction of the Lord on how to build it, that it is not built after the manner of men. And so this is, all of these things are like temples. And it's your body, right? It's also your body. Our body, the commandments that we receive here in mortality are meant, I think, to create our bodies line upon line and precept upon precept as we align more and more with the exact measurements of who we are supposed to be. We change our body. That's actually scientific. We actually change our DNA in terms of what is, maybe not of all the information that is in there, but we do change the activation of our DNA, of our genes, by our experiences. So there's something to that. So let's go in here to chapter 35 of Exodus. And I want you to notice here at the very beginning, here's verse 1. And Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said unto them, These are the words which the Lord hath commanded that ye should do them. This is our DBR. And some of you, I oftentimes, this is probably the thing I get the most, the question I get the most in comments is, what is DBR? Can you explain this? I've got a video on that, or a podcast episode, so you can look that up. It's called Alma's DBR. But this is basically it, right? When Moses is going to say, these are the words, and this isn't just a stretch on this concept. This is something real. This is a thing. I'm writing about this in the book that I'm going to release this year. It basically is about the fluid hierarchy that I talk about. And so we have the Lord giving the word to his prophet, Moses. And then Moses turns around and gives the word to the people, right? And you can even go down into different levels of the hierarchical structure of the priesthood. It's what runs along the line of the priesthood to be delivered to you. And ultimately, where does that source come from? Well, it's the word. It's the Logos. It's Jesus Christ. So that term right there, if you look in the underlying Hebrew of these are the words, you'll see Devarim, right? It's the root of DBR. That's what DBR is, right? DBR is the Hebrew root for several words, including word. Order is another one. It can be commandment, depending. It's not always commandment. Speak is almost always DBR. This is, in fact, the Hebrew name for the book of Deuteronomy, right? Is basically the words. All right. Now, if we go down here a little bit further, and I'm gonna go down to verse 5 here. Notice this. This is about the temple. It says, "Take ye from among you an offering unto the Lord. Whosoever is of a willing heart." This is a little bit of a theme going through these chapters. This is all about our effort. This is all about our hearts. It's not just a commandment. Remember, with atonement, you have the commandment coming down, the word coming down to us, and then we have to have our merits. Yes, we have to have our merits, our obedience, our repentance, our own grace and mercy, reaching up to God and reaching out to others. So it requires a willing heart here. This gets interesting as we get down a little further. And then in verse 6, "And blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen and goat's hair." So these are the materials that are going to be needed for the tabernacle. Importantly, again, blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen. The linen would be white. These are the 4 colors of the veil in that is separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies. It's also the color of numerous other, we'll call them curtains instead of the veil, that are in the tabernacle. Those colors are all over the place. They represent the elements of the earth. They also, as I've talked about previously, probably, especially, well, let's wait till we get to the veil. We'll talk about that. Other items are and oil for the light, and spices for anointing oil, and for the sweet incense. The tabernacle, his tent, and his covering. Interesting, you have the term covering there. Now, the tabernacle, his tent, and his covering. This is, remember that the tabernacle is a tent. So the Feast of Tabernacles is when the tents are all there in front of the temple, facing the temple. And that's what happens at the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths, as it's sometimes called. This is likely what happened with King Benjamin at the temple. All right, then we get the ark and the staves thereof with the mercy seat and the veil of the covering. Right, so the mercy seat is the covering, the kipperet, the covering of the Ark of the Covenant. It's not the Ark of the Covenant, but it is kind of part of it, right? It is the lid, and likely with the cherubim on it, probably is what creates the seat, and what we really ought to probably call that is the throne of God there. So this is also, as we look at this is also, in a way, kind of like the spiritual creation of this. He's telling you, the Lord is telling us through Moses how the tabernacle is going to be created. When we talk about the creation, it's everything about the temple. Those are not separate events. The reason we have the story of the creation in the temple is because the temple is the story of the creation. That's what it is. And so as we get these details, this is kind of like the spiritual creation of the tabernacle here. And then there will be an actual physical creation of the tabernacle. Beyond the mercy seat here, then we get the table and his staves and all his vessels and the showbread. So that's the table that would be in the holy place. That's the middle area. The candlestick or the menorah, also for the light, and his furniture and his lamps with oil and for light. So we get all of these different elements. Now, in 15, and the incense altar and his staves and the anointing oil and the sweet incense and the hanging for the door at the entering of the tabernacle. That's out on the east end. That's not the veil. That's for entering into the temple, or the tabernacle. But the incense altar, remember, the incense altar is what is in front of the veil. Remember that. It's what's in front of the veil. The incense altar is an Aaronic priesthood altar. That incense represents prayer. Right? It is that sweet incense, as it burns on the coals there on the altar, it is what rises up to God. That's what it represents. And it is in front of the veil before you get to the veil. 16, the altar of burnt offering with his brazen grate, his staves, and all his vessels, the laver and his foot. So that's like our baptismal font at the temple. Now, if you're on video, you can see the diagram here of the tabernacle. And as you see on the right side here, the arrow heading to the left, this is looking at it as if we're looking at the cardinal directions. So at the right is the east. So you come in from the east, that's where the sun rises. So right, it follows the arc of the sun. It comes in from the east, and on the far left end is the Holy of Holies. That is on the west side where the sun sets. Like, for example, I believe that one of the hieroglyphics for the Egyptian hieroglyphics for God is a picture of two pillars with the sun setting to the west. It's what's furthest over to, it's where God would reside, so to speak. That's kind of a representation of where the Holy of Holies sits. But you see to the right here, you have the entrance gate. Think here about, this is the outer courtyard. This is, right, it's in three different parts, like three different kingdoms. You have here the altar of burnt offerings. So this is outside here in the outer court. This is where all the burnt offerings come. This is where the families come in. They bring their burnt offering. The priest is going to essentially barbecue the animal. And then as they barbecue the animal, they're going to break that into pieces and make an offering with this. You also have the laver here. This is like the baptismal font. Now, what's interesting is if you go to Nephi's words, the words where he talks about baptism as the gate, right? Now, don't get confused with where they call the entrance gate here on this diagram over here. But the gate here, this would be the gate in front of entering into the holy place, would be baptism. That's how I see it. And he says, well, is baptism it? Are you done after you've been baptized? Well, of course not, because you've got to go all the way through, right? Think of it in terms of the temple. You've got to go all the way through to the west, through the holy place, through the ordinances and covenants and rituals of the holy place, which I would say is the Aaronic priesthood place. And then you finally need to move into the Melchizedek priesthood place, which would be the Holy of Holies, right? You've got to pass through both of these priesthoods until you end up at the veil, right here, and then you actually are able to pass through and meet God here. And unlike what the children of Israel did, right, see the face of God at the veil and enter in at his throne. And this is, when you think about the visions of the prophets, and they have these theophanies, these throne visions, think about the Holy of Holies. This is in a sense a temple vision that you're seeing. And this is part of, to me, where the tabernacle and the temple come from, or from these visions that these prophets have. This is what Moses would have seen, I believe, in the vision on Sinai. Remember, the entire instruction here for the tabernacle was given to Moses by the Lord. As he's on Sinai, he sees this. He sees the vision of the creation and the vision of the Garden of Eden on Sinai, and brings that back and incorporates that down into the building with the specificity from the Lord of the building of the tabernacle. That is why we have the story of the creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, in the temple. It's not to go back and look at some history of things. It is creation and Garden of Eden are the temple. That you can't separate these things. Now, just to get a little bit more specific here on this diagram, we see the altar of burnt offerings, the laver or baptismal font going to the west. We get the door here, right? The gate that you come into. On the south end here, you see the menorah. Maybe there was another one in the Holy of Holies. I wonder about that. I think it's possible. Something similar anyway. And then on this end is the table of the showbread. So the showbread is, you see these two pieces of the showbread here. This would be stacked up 6 high and 6 high, these loaves, for a total of 12, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, in addition to this, and it doesn't show it here, but in addition to this, there would be wine. There would be wine in vessels here that would go along with that. And what does that mean? What does that represent? Well, that's kind of something rooted there in our sacrament, in the Christian Eucharist. That is sitting here in the Aaronic priesthood place, right? And then further on here to the west, still in the holy place, you have the altar of incense. This is where Zacharias is burning the incense in front of the veil when Gabriel visits him. Now, obviously not right here in the tabernacle, but in Herod's temple, in the second temple, that is what is happening with Zacharias. And of course, again, Zacharias being an Aaronic priest, John the Baptist, who will be his son and the icon of the Aaronic priesthood, of course, this is where Gabriel meets him, at the altar of incense in front of the veil, right? It's the Aaronic priesthood. Going in further, you see these 4 pillars. I think that is correct. And maybe 2 of these are representations of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and maybe the tree of life. I don't know. This gets very murky in our understanding here. Not a surprise. These are the first things that you lose anciently are things about the temple rites, and especially things that are associated with the Melchizedek priesthood. And then here you have the veil, right? This is the veil made of those 4 colors and materials. And then moving in here, you have the Ark of the Covenant with the kipperet right on the top there, which is the covering or the lid that would sit over the Holy of Holies, with the cherubim on top. Now, I want to go back to verse 21 here, down a little bit further, and we see here, and they came everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whom his spirit made willing. Now let's go back and read that again. This is why I brought up the willing heart before. And they came everyone whose heart stirred them up, like a broken heart, and everyone whom his spirit made willing, like a contrite spirit. So a broken heart and a contrite spirit. We actually get those exact words in the Old Testament. That is it's in the Psalms. I want to say it might be in Proverbs, maybe somewhere else also. It's in the Book of Mormon before the time of Christ. There is another fallacy we find in the cultural doctrine of Latter-day Saints. And I've even heard this from the pulpit. And I mean the pulpit. It is that once the animal sacrifices ended, then the new requirement as a sacrifice was going to be the broken heart and a contrite spirit. That's not true. That's not true. A broken heart and a contrite spirit has always been required. Always been required. You see that willingness that is reiterated here throughout these chapters. And yes, it's for participating in building it, but it's the same thing required in entering into the temple, a broken heart and a contrite spirit. So when the animal sacrifices end, that's because Christ was the ultimate sacrifice. But our sacrifice never was limited to just the animal, right? The sacrifice always required us to have a broken heart and a contrite spirit. That is the ticket to enter into the fluid hierarchy and to submit to God. Is our own, we need to understand it. It's about becoming. It's about belonging to that line up to God. And so, of course, it wouldn't start when Christ was gone. That's part of the gospel. It's always been there. So again, 21, and they came, everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whose spirit was made willing. And they brought the Lord's offering to the work of the tabernacle of the congregation, and for all his service, and for the holy garments. Now here in 25, and all the women that were wise-hearted, again, talking about the heart here, did spin with their hands and brought that which they had spun, both of blue and of purple and of scarlet and of fine linen, because that's what all these curtains and the veil is going to be made of. Now here's something important to understand. In the Proto-Evangelium of James, this is a non-canonical Christian work, you have the story of Mary weaving the veil of the temple. And it talks about her being as a young woman working in the temple. She was part of the temple working there, and she weaved the veil, or was one of the weavers of the veil. So this is something that was not only a role that was that women took on in weaving and creating garments and clothing and for tents, right? This is a big deal for a lot of people. still with the Bedouins today. This is a part of, this is a clearer understanding of what Mary and Christ are, I think, when you understand this. So in that story, she's weaving the veil, which are the 4 colors, the 4 materials, and the veil, right? Understand that. Why is Mary doing that? Because women represent the veil. I've talked about this. Women represent the veil because the veil represents material, right? The physical world. Think about the word material. Where does that come from? Mater, the Latin mater. What is that? That's mother. Mother, women are the producers of material. They are the producers of the material, the eternal body that we have. And so, as you see here in this one, if you're on video, you can see there is this kind of interesting 3 men of some type of status, maybe wise men, maybe the high priest, and his, let's call them counselors. They did have counselors. And one of them is handing a section of wool, right, some raw wool, to Mary here. And what is she going to do with this? Well, she's weaving the veil, but it also means she's going to be a mother, right? She's going to be a mother, and it's going to be Jesus Christ. So when we think about, I think it's Matthew or Mark, I can't remember, I always forget this, but I think in the other Gospels, mostly you have when Christ is on the cross and he's died, right? The Romans put a spear into his side and split his side, so to speak. But in it's either, I think it's Matthew. In Matthew, it's either Matthew or Mark, but I think Matthew, you don't have that story, but you have something very similar. And that is that when Christ dies, the veil in the temple rents instead of his side renting with a spear. And when you think about Mary as the mother of Christ and as the weaver of the veil, then that you start to get a greater context and understanding of what is happening there, why that is being told, what that is. Yes, it is a renting of the veil, meaning that in a sense that his job is done and it opens up the veil, so to speak, to God for us to be able to get there because of his event. But it's also his body. It's also his body. Now, what else is the veil? What else acts as the veil? It's your garment. In fact, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. So, in a sense, you're taking on Christ there, right? And it's a, I'm not going to go into too much into that in this, but I think it's important to understand that. And I think that story about Mary in the temple weaving the veil gives us a lot more context on what the temple means, what the veil represents, and the story of the veil renting. Now, I'm not going to cover much more in Exodus here, but just a couple of things. They have wise-hearted men are chosen to work on the tabernacle. And this is just kind of interesting because it's the wise men. These are, to me, would be people that would be more like of the court, right? They're people that are very skilled and are able to put these things together as far as metallurgy, as far as architecture, construction, whatever else it might be, carpentry. And that's kind of an interesting thing because they are brought together throughout this whole chapter here in 36. And there's a tie to the temple. And so there's kind of this idea, honestly, of like the Masons, who were the bricklayers and makers of the Temple of Solomon. And how that tradition anyway, I don't know if that actually goes back to that point, but that's what they're drawing on, is that kind of a legacy of this curious workmanship that we get that we're told of in the Book of Mormon and in the Old Testament, that is oftentimes tied to high levels of skill and oftentimes to the temple and the materials that are used and created for the temple. Also of note is that they have 11 curtains here. These are the large curtains over the tabernacle that are creating the tabernacle, I believe, or on the sides. They're also the same color, but this is an interesting point here to see. Verse 18, and he made 50 taches of brass. This would be like the couplings, the loops of brass to couple the tent together that it might be one. Now, understand how that term one is being used here. It's bringing all 11 curtains together as if they are one. That's the same. The word that is used there is echad in Hebrew. And echad is not just one. It's actually used for what we call day one also. But oftentimes it's used in a way to mean a unit, or better, a union. And so it is likely, I believe, when you talk about John 17, and this is where we get the difference between the Trinity and the Godhead. When Christ says, when Jesus is talking to his Father actually about his disciples, he says, I want them to be one, echad, with me, just Father, as you and I are one. Well, of course, the disciples can't be part of the Trinity, right? So what does one mean? What does it mean when Christ and the Father are one? It means they're one in purpose. It means they're one in their minds. It's just like a Zion people, right? One in heart. And that's exactly what is being stated here in verse 18, that it might be one. Now, down to the veil here, again, we'll get more specific on this. And he made a veil of blue and purple and scarlet and fine twined linen with cherubim. That should be cherubim. The S should not be on there, right? I am in Hebrew is plural. So it's redundant, but with cherubim made he it of cunning work. By the way, again, when you're talking about the Garden of Eden story, and they say that, they're going to place cherubim with a flaming sword, that is not one angel as it's usually depicted in artwork. Right? That's not what that is. It means it's plural. So it's at least two that would be there in that story. But here are the four colors of the veil, and then it goes on and says, and fine twined linen with cherubims made he it of cunning work. So the cherubim, the angels, or the figures, cherubim are oftentimes made something like the parts of an animal, like a lion, oftentimes, and a man, or even wings with a lion, or all three, or many different. Same thing as like a seraphim. It's symbolic, right? It's all symbolic. And so there are cherubim on the veil. And why would there be cherubim on the veil? Why would those be in there? Because these are the hosts of heaven. This is part of the hierarchical structure around the throne of God. It's also, when you think about it, again, think about your temple experience when you're going through this temple imagery. When you go to the veil, are there angels there that meet you there to get you through? Yes. Right? So think about your temple experience as you go through this. Now, over in 37, verse 6, this is about the mercy seat. Remember what mercy means. We think about this in our minds, we compartmentalize this in a modern world as mercy and love, meaning a feeling. It is a feeling that is a result of mercy and love. But we really cheapen the idea of love, I believe, by making it a feeling. We romanticize it in a way that really takes away from effort and sacrifice. Mercy, the mercy of God, when you think about where that word comes from, for example, the mercy of God is, the word mercy comes from the term payment, right? Think about a market. That comes from the same root, where there's transactions that are being made. A merchant, same word as mercy. A mercenary who's paid to go to war. In Spanish, a market is a mercado. So love is payment. Payment for righteousness, for others. That's what Christ did. So when we talk about the idea of atonement, to atone for someone's sins, we use that, which is a made-up English word. It's that word itself is not in the scriptures. The English put that in. And I think it was Tyndale. But that word it means effort. It means sacrifice. That's what the Lord did for us. That's what his mercy is for us. It is suffering. It is sacrifice. It is payment. It is effort. And that's more along the lines of how anciently love was thought of. It was thought of as a verb and not a noun. The feeling of love is a result, right, of what real love is. So what is the real word under this in Hebrew for mercy seat, which is the lid, the kipperet? I just gave it to you, the kipperet that sits on top of the Ark of the Covenant, where the throne of God is, which is called, think about that, the throne of God is called the mercy seat, the atonement seat, as we might also consider it. It's called the kipperet, the covering. So when you think of the Day of Atonement, that gives you another flavor of what that means, right? It's called Yom Kippur, Kipperet, the Day of Covering. So the Day of the Mercy Seat, which is a representation of payment. It is a representation of the atonement. It is the actual throne of God that he sits on because of love, right? Because of the love as it was thought of anciently. Now, if we go down to verse 7 here, we see, and he made 2 cherubim of gold, beaten out of one piece made he them, and the 2 ends of the mercy seat. And the cherubim on the end of this side, and another cherubim on the other end on that side, out of the mercy seat, made he the cherubim on the 2 ends thereof. So this is not usually how this is depicted. This is the same piece, right? The kipperet, the lid, and the cherubim are all the same piece of metal, and it's a throne. So we oftentimes see something along the lines of what we've seen maybe in Indiana Jones, right, as a representation of the Ark of the Covenant. If you're on video, I would say something like this, where you have the 2 wings reaching out to each other. They're sitting on the top. Tell me where you're going to sit on that. If that's a throne, where does the Lord sit? That is not a throne to me. I might be wrong. I've never seen the Ark of the Covenant myself, but that doesn't seem right to me. And when you look at the description of it, I think it's very different. Now, this other piece is not quite what I'm saying, but it's more along the lines of what I believe would have been like a throne. So those 2 wings in the front are still in the way, but the wings in the back would fit kind of like as a back of the seat. This is an Egyptian piece. So in the Middle East, you would have had something like this, right? This is a common thing as a representation. And no, that doesn't mean that it's drawing from the Egyptians and it's pagan, and that it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with their culture. To the Israelites, what did a throne represent? What did it mean to have a couple of cherubim on top of something like this? Like this also has a lid covering something that would probably be very, very sacred inside. Remember, in the Ark of the Covenant, you had Aaron's rod, you had a bowl of manna, and you had the second set of tablets that sat inside here. But this is a little more throne-like and more along the ideas, in my mind anyway, of what we'd be talking about with the kipperet, the mercy seat, the throne of God. Then quickly here in chapter 39, just again, we get the garments that are made for Aaron and the priests. Who are the priests? They are the sons and the sons of the sons of Aaron only. Those who the priests are. So we hear about the Levites. Aaron and Moses are Levites. And so all of the males of the tribe of Levi would be Levites. But that means that they do receive the Levitical priesthood, but they are not priests. And the way you would look at that is in a contemporary filter with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is the priests are the ones that handle the offerings and the sacrifices. just like they do today on the altars in each of our chapels, the sacrament tables, where the offering of Christ, his body and his blood, are laid out on that altar. And it's the priests that administer that. But who prepares it? Who gets it ready and who distributes it? Those would be the Levites, the teachers and the deacons, who also, by the way, collected the tithes and supported the priests in their work. But that's kind of how we get, when we hear about the Levitical priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood, and sometimes we think that they're kind of the same thing. They kind of are, but they kind of aren't, right? You have priests and you have Levites. They're all Levites, but the priests in the Old Testament are direct descendants of Aaron. And then again, you get the specifics on the garb of the priests, the temple robes. And they wrought onyx stones enclosed in ouches of gold, graven as signets are graven with the names of the children of Israel on each of the 12, probably brought to them by each of the elders or princes of each of the tribes. And he put them on the shoulders of the ephod, that they should be stones for a memorial to the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded Moses. Well, there's representation of that in the temple today, in the robes today, at least in some of them. And then down in 27, and they made coats of fine linen of woven work for Aaron and for his sons, and a meter of fine linen, and goodly bonnets of fine linen, and linen breeches of fine twined linen. Remember, this is a part of what is in the veil. And the meter is the cap, right? Or crown, if you will. And again, the garment should be tied directly to what is the veil. The garment here, this is the linen, but overall, everything that's put on with the high priest, that has the same 4 colors. And yes, that is represented in your garment today and in the veil today. And I'm not going to go into that right now. In chapter 40, just a mention here, and Aaron and his sons are washed and anointed and given an everlasting priesthood, right? So even though we look through this, and it's really hard sometimes in the Old Testament to identify anything in here that means anything to us. Again, if you think about the temple, if you think about your temple experience as you go through some of these, the visions and the discussion on priesthood and robes and the tabernacle and the temple being built, if you bring in your own temple experience, it will enrich it greatly, I promise. So here we have the washing and anointing of the priests. All right, moving on to the book of Leviticus, chapter 1, verse 1. And again, what do we get here? And the Lord called unto Moses, DBR. The Lord called unto Moses. See how that is always, they outline this for us constantly, the idea of DBR. The Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him, that is DBR in Hebrew, out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, speak, DBR, unto the children of Israel. This is, in understanding this principle, we understand prophecy. We understand priesthood. We understand revelation. Revelation is not a bottom-up thing. Yes, we seek for it. Yes, we work for it. And we have some responsibility in when we're ready to receive revelation. But revelation itself is a top-down principle. In verse 5, Aaron's son shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood around the top upon the altar, that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. So again, the pieces here are similar to the bread that we have. Why do we do that in the sacrament? Why do the priests, why don't we just already have that done? Why are the priests splitting that up and breaking that apart? Again, we go back to the idea that I've talked about previously of karaperit. That's cut a covenant. That's how the Israelites used to say, make a covenant. Well, of course, we're renewing our covenants in the sacramental ordinance, of taking on the name of Christ. At baptism, which is both going down into the waters of baptism and receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost. Both of those together are a full and complete baptism. Then I'm going to skip all the way to 16 here. And 16 is a treasure trove of temple information. So I would recommend that if there's anything, if you don't have a lot of time to go through everything this week, at least hit this chapter. And you may not understand it all at first, but again, go into this chapter reading this with an understanding of your temple experience, every little thing you do as you go through the temple. This is going to give us an outline of the Day of Atonement and what happens on the Day of Atonement. And the Lord said unto Moses, here we get again, by the way, verse 1, and the Lord spake unto Moses, right? So that there is DBR. After the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they offered before the Lord and died, because they didn't do it properly. And the Lord said unto Moses, speak unto Aaron, DBR, thy brother, and he come not at all times into the holy place. You can't always come in. You're only going to come in one day a year, right? That is on Yom Kippur. That is the Day of Atonement. That's when you come into the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, that he die not. So again, oftentimes I don't know that we're really talking about actual mortal death when we use the term die. Is this actually die? Maybe it is. Or is it talking about a spiritual death? You can't do this. You have a separation from the Spirit. In other words, the Spirit of God. Now, of course, outside of Sundays and Mondays, we can do this in the temple today, every other day, not just once a year. And in verse 7 here, and he shall take the two goats, right? We've talked about this, where he's going to take one goat. This is going to be the sacrificial goat. He's going to take the one goat. He is going to remove all of the sins off of that goat, take them on himself. He acts as Christ in that way. He does have the name Jehovah, holiness to Jehovah, as a plate on his head, on his meter. And then he's going to take those and he's going to put his hands over on the other goat, the scapegoat, and he's going to lay all the sins over onto the scapegoat. The scapegoat is going to head out be banned out of the city. And eventually, later on, they started running it off of a cliff. In verse 8, and Aaron shall cast lots upon the two goats. So they did it by casting lots. This was how they thought the Lord would be choosing, in a way. Think about Nephi and his brothers outside the walls of Jerusalem. They cast lots. And I think there's a sense of, hey, the Lord will be in charge of this. And if we put this up randomly, the Lord is going to be the one who chooses who goes. And so the lots choose who will be the sacrificial goat and who will be the scapegoat. And again, I've brought up this example many times. You have the same thing happening with Pilate in the New Testament, where you have Barabbas and you have Jesus. One of them is going to be the sacrificial goat, and one of them is going to be the scapegoat. And of course, Pilate wants Jesus to be the scapegoat, where he's just banned out of Jerusalem. And Barabbas, who is the real thief, the guilty one, is going to actually be the one to be sacrificed. But the lot is cast by the people and not by God, by mostly the Sadducees and the high priests. And they are the ones that call for Christ, for Jesus to be the one who is going to be the sacrificial goat. That's exactly what's happening right there with those two. So verse 10, but the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord, before Jehovah, to make an atonement with him, and to let him go for a scapegoat into the wilderness. Verse 12, and he shall take a censer. Look up what a censer looks like. This is all part of your temple experience today. Right? That's what holds the burning coals. And he shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar before the Lord, and his hand full of sweet incense, beaten small, and bring it within the veil. Right? This is all about your temple experience. And he shall put the incense upon the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat. So that's where the cloud comes from. And that is upon the testimony or the covenant that he die not. All right, then as we continue to go down here, he's going to take the blood of the bullock and later the blood of the goat as well, and he's going to sprinkle them. He's going to purify the whole temple. He's going to purify the Ark of the Covenant, and then he's going to purify the people as well, and the land. So I recommend that you go through this verse by verse and read it with your temple experience in mind. And it will help enrich what your experience is, I believe, and give you more context. Remember that as you go through the temple experience, it's two things. It is about royalty and it is about priesthood. So you are going through the temple experience like a royal procession. You are going through to be crowned as a king or a queen. But you're also going through all the ordinances and everything, like what's happening here on the Day of Atonement with the high priest, right? You're also going through that to have all of the fullness of the priesthood, to be a priest or a priestess. This is the temple experience. Now, just a couple of quick things here in chapter 19. Of course, what does verse 1 say? And the Lord spake, that's DBR, unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the congregation of the children of Israel, and saying to them, Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Holiness to the Lord. This is still about the temple. And so you'll see, as we've brought these things in about the priesthood and about coronation in the temple, there's still some more here that kind of relate to what's going on in the temple. There's the a commandment of turn ye not unto idols, nor make to yourself molten gods. I am the Lord your God. I am Jehovah. And I am your God. So don't put things before me. This happens later on in the temple. Again, the reference to offering something at your own will in verse 5. I think 14 is interesting. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shalt fear thy God. I am the Lord. Of course, this is the exact opposite of what's happening in the New Testament times, right? Where Christ is healing the deaf and healing the blind, and others are cursing them and saying this was because of your own sins or your parents' sins. But what's interesting again here, I think, is the term of stumbling block. I really do believe that this is part of a metaphor that sits in the royal procession metaphor. And that is that as you go through the royal procession and you're moving toward the temple and toward the Holy of Holies, like Christ did on the donkey toward the temple, the stumbling block is what is in the way. In the way. How should I rephrase that? The stumbling block can block the way. What is the way? The way is the way of kings. Not the book, but the way of kings, which is the royal procession of ultimately Jesus, the King of Kings, coming through the way. So what needs to happen is the stumbling blocks need to be removed out of the way, right? So that the king can come through. Or also we can say so that the Melchizedek can come through, the king of righteousness. We are also kings and queens of righteousness if we've been through the temple, if we receive the holy priesthood as a priesthood bearer. So the stumbling blocks are part of the Aaronic priesthood because they are what John would say, prepare ye the way. How do you do that? You repent, you clear the path, you remove the stumbling blocks. In 18, we get, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's what Jesus is pulling from when he talks about the first and second commandments. We get some commandments about eating blood, because the blood, not to eat blood because it is the life, right? It represents the life. You think about, again, the Day of Atonement, how sacred that blood is and what it does. And so eating something that would represent that is a no-no, right? It's blasphemy. And then we get something else here in 29. Do not prostitute thy daughter to cause her to be a whore. You know, we get some very blunt words in the Old Testament. Lest the land fall to whoredom and the land become full of wickedness. So why is this here? What is this talking about as it goes into the Sabbath and familiar spirits and other things? Well, again, this is the law of chastity, again, which is something that we find in the temple. So I hope that helps a little bit. Think about your temple experience as you go through this week. Think about your temple experience, and you will see things that you never saw before using that interpreter, that Cwic interpreter of temple imagery and drama. There is some drama in here with the Day of Atonement. right? And understand what they're doing as they go through the rituals. But as we think about the different objects and the architecture of the tabernacle and the creation, right? And in some ways, the high priest acting as Adam, and maybe the king would act as Adam and the queen would act as Eve also in a temple drama. We can think about this temple imagery and relate it to our current temple experience. It's there if we understand it clearer. And if we can do more of these things in the Old Testament, we can draw out these truths and make this scripture that much more rich instead of kind of glazing over it at times because we don't understand it.